In the sun-drenched suburbs of Phoenix, Arizona, where perfectly manicured lawns defied the desert heat and backyard pools shimmered like mirages, the Hartley family seemed to epitomize the American dream. Richard Hartley, a successful real estate developer, had built their sprawling Spanish-style home with his own hands. His wife, Evelyn, a former beauty queen turned interior designer, had transformed the house into a showpiece worthy of any home and garden magazine. Their daughter, Melissa, had just turned 18 and was preparing for her freshman year at Arizona State University. With her mother's golden hair and her father's piercing blue eyes, Melissa was the pride of the Hartley family, a straight student with a bright future ahead of her. But beneath the polished veneer of their lives, cracks were beginning to form. As Melissa blossomed into womanhood, Evelyn found herself grappling with a growing sense of dissatisfaction. At 45, she felt the first whispers of middle age creeping up on her. The reflection in the mirror each morning seemed a little less radiant, a little more lined. Richard, absorbed in his work and the pressure of maintaining their lavish lifestyle, had become increasingly distant. Their conversations, once filled with passion and shared dreams, had dwindled to perfunctory exchanges about schedules and household matters. It was into this atmosphere of unspoken tension that Jake Morty entered their lives. A 20-year-old sophomore at ASU, Jake had met Melissa at a pre-college orientation event. With his olive skin, dark curls, and easy charm, Jake was unlike anyone Melissa had dated before. When Melissa first brought Jake home to meet her parents, Evelyn felt a jolt of electricity she hadn't experienced in years. She found herself captivated by his boyish grin, his well-defined arms, the way his t-shirt clung to his muscular chest. As Jake regaled them with stories of his Italian-American family in New Jersey and his dreams of becoming a chef, Evelyn hung on his every word. Richard, preoccupied with a difficult client call, barely registered Jake's presence. But Evelyn made up for her husband's inattention with an abundance of warmth and hospitality. She insisted Jake stay for dinner, pulling out her best recipes and finest china. As the weeks passed, Jake became a frequent visitor to the Hartley home. Evelyn always seemed to be around when he came over, offering snacks, asking about his classes, finding excuses to linger in the living room while Jake and Melissa studied. Melissa, at first pleased by her mother's approval of her boyfriend, began to feel a growing sense of unease. She noticed the way Evelyn's eyes followed Jake's movements, how she laughed a little too loudly at his jokes, touched his arm a little too often. One afternoon, Melissa came home early from swim practice to find Evelyn and Jake in the kitchen. Her mother, wearing a form-fitting yoga outfit, was standing unnecessarily close to Jake as she showed him how to knead dough for homemade pizza. The look of rapt attention on Jake's face sent a chill down Melissa's spine. "Mom? Jake? What's going on?" Melissa's voice cut through the charged atmosphere like a knife. Evelyn jumped back, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "Oh, honey, you're home early. I was just teaching Jake how to make my famous margherita pizza. You know how much he loves Italian food." Jake nodded, his expression a mixture of guilt and confusion. "Yeah, your mom's an amazing cook. I hope I can learn even half of what she knows." Melissa forced a smile, but inside her mind was racing. Had she imagined the tension in the room? The way her mother's hand had lingered on Jake's arm, the look of admiration in Jake's eyes as he gazed at Evelyn. On that night, as Melissa lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She thought back over the past few weeks, recalling little moments that had seemed innocuous at the time but now took on a sinister cast. The way her mother always seemed to be wearing her most flattering outfits when Jake was around. The hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when Melissa entered a room. Determined to prove her suspicions unfounded, Melissa began to watch her mother and Jake more closely. She started coming home unexpectedly, making excuses to stay in the house when Jake came over. But rather than easing her fears, her observations only fueled them. She noticed how Evelyn's eyes lit up whenever Jake entered a room, the way she leaned in just a little too close when they spoke. Jake, for his part, seemed to bask in Evelyn's attention, his chest puffing out slightly whenever she complimented him. As summer progressed and the Arizona heat intensified, so did the tension in the Hartley household. Richard, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, spent more and more time at the office. And Melissa, torn between her love for Jake and her growing suspicions, became moody and withdrawn. Evelyn, meanwhile, seemed to come alive in a way she hadn't in years. She started taking greater care with her appearance, scheduling regular appointments at the spa and buying new, more youthful clothes. Once she threw herself into planning elaborate dinner parties, always making sure to invite Jake. One sweltering August evening, as the Hartleys and Jake lounged by the pool, Evelyn emerged from the house carrying a tray of margaritas. She wore a new bikini, the turquoise fabric emphasizing her still enviable figure. As she bent to set the tray down, her eyes met Jake's, and a look passed between them that made Melissa's blood run cold. At night, after Jake had gone home and her parents had retired to their separate bedrooms, Melissa sat at her computer, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. With a deep breath, she began to type out an email to Jake. "We need to talk," she wrote. "I can't shake the feeling that something's going on between you and my mom. If there is, I need to know. Please, Jake, be honest with me." And her finger trembled over the send button. Was she overreacting? Imagining things, but the memory of that look by the pool steeled her resolve. She clicked send and waited. Jake's reply came the next morning, a terse message asking her to meet him at their favorite coffee shop. As Melissa drove to the cafe, her mind raced with possibilities. Would Jake confess to an inappropriate flirtation? Reassure her that it was all in her head? Break up with her? The sight of Jake sitting at their usual table, his face pale and drawn, sent Melissa's heart plummeting. She slid into the seat across from him, searching his eyes for answers. Jake began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to say this. Your mom, she's been coming on to me. At first I thought she was just being friendly, but lately, it's gotten intense. She's been texting me, sending me these suggestive messages. I didn't know how to tell you. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me." Melissa felt as if the ground had fallen away beneath her. She had suspected, yes, but hearing it confirmed was like a physical blow. "Have you? Has anything happened between you?" she managed to ask, dreading the answer. Jake shook his head vehemently. "No, God, no, I would never do that to you, Mel. I love you, but your mom, she's not taking no for an answer. I don't know what to do." As Jake pulled out his phone and showed Melissa the stream of messages from her mother, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The texts started innocuously enough, asking about Jake's day, sending him recipes she thought he'd like. But as Melissa scrolled, the messages became increasingly flirtatious, then explicitly sexual. "I can't stop thinking about you," one message read. "You make me feel alive again. We could be so good together, Jake. Melissa doesn't have to know." Melissa pushed the phone away, unable to read any more. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile the woman in those messages with the mother she thought she knew. "I need to confront her," Melissa said, her voice shaking. "This has to stop." Jake reached across the table, taking her hand. "Do you want me to come with you?" Melissa shook her head. "No, I need to do this alone. But thank you for telling me the truth." As Melissa drove home, her emotions oscillated between rage and heartbreak. How could her mother do this? How long had this been going on? And how could she have been so blind? She found Evelyn in the backyard, tending to her prized rose garden. For a moment, Melissa just watched her mother, trying to see her as Jake must have seen her. Here, despite her age, Evelyn was still strikingly beautiful, her skin golden from the Arizona sun, her body toned from years of yoga and Pilates. Melissa called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk." Evelyn looked up, smiling at her daughter. But as she took in Melissa's expression, the smile faltered. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Melissa took a deep breath. "I know about you and Jake. I've seen the messages, Mom. How could you do this?" The color drained from Evelyn's face. For a moment, she seemed to age years before Melissa's eyes. Then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. "You don't understand, Melissa. Jake and I, we have a connection. He sees me in a way your father hasn't in years." Melissa felt as if she'd been slapped. "A connection. He's my boyfriend, Mom. He's barely older than me." Evelyn's eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and desperation. "Age is just a number. Jake is mature beyond his years. He appreciates me, values me. Do you have any idea what it's like to feel invisible? To watch your youth slip away while your husband barely notices you're alive?" As Evelyn's words poured out, a lifetime of pent-up frustration and resentment spilling over, Melissa felt her anger giving way to a profound sadness. This woman before her, railing against the inevitability of aging, seemed like a stranger. "Mom," Melissa said softly, "this isn't about Dad, or about you feeling valued. This is about you betraying me, betraying our family. Jake doesn't want you. He showed me the messages. He's been trying to let you down gently." Evelyn's face crumpled, a mix of humiliation and fury washing over her features. "He told you? He showed you private messages? How dare he? How dare you go through my personal communications?" Melissa took a step back, alarmed by the venom in her mother's voice. "Mom, please. This has to stop. If you don't end this, I'll have to tell Dad." At the mention of Richard, something dangerous flashed in Evelyn's eyes. "You'll do no such thing," she hissed. "This is between Jake and me. Your father doesn't need to know anything." With that, Evelyn stormed into the house, leaving Melissa alone in the garden, surrounded by the sweet scent of roses and the bitter taste of betrayal. Over the next few days, a tense silence fell over the Hartley household. Evelyn avoided Melissa's gaze, spending most of her time locked in her studio or out of the house on mysterious errands. Richard, still oblivious to the drama unfolding under his roof, commented vaguely on the weird vibe, but didn't press the issue. Melissa, torn between loyalty to her father and a desperate hope that her mother would come to her senses, found herself in an impossible position. She urged Jake to stay away from the house, at least until things cooled down. But Jake, worried about Melissa and feeling guilty about his role in the family's turmoil, was reluctant to abandon her. It was Jake's concern that led him to the Hartley house on that fateful Friday evening. Richard was out of town at a real estate conference, and Melissa had gone to a friend's house for a study session. Ike thought it would be the perfect opportunity to speak with Evelyn alone, to make it clear once and for all that nothing could ever happen between them. As Jake pulled into the Hartley circular driveway, he noticed that the house was unusually dark. Only a faint light shone from Evelyn's second-floor studio. Steeling himself, Jake rang the doorbell. Evelyn answered, her face a mask of surprise that quickly gave way to a coy smile. "Jake," she purred, "what a pleasant surprise." "Come in." Jake stepped into the foyer, immediately regretting his decision to come alone. Evelyn was wearing a silky robe, her hair tousled as if she'd just gotten out of bed. The air was heavy with the scent of her perfume. "Mrs. Hartley," Jake began, trying to keep his voice steady, "I came to talk. About the messages, about everything. This has to stop." Evelyn's smile faltered for a moment before returning, brighter and more determined. "Oh, Jake," she said, stepping closer to him, "I know you don't mean that. I've seen the way you look at me. I know you feel this connection between us." Jake took a step back, his heart racing. "No, Mrs. Hartley, there is no connection. I love Melissa. What you're doing, it's not right. Please, for everyone's sake, let this go." Something dark flashed in Evelyn's eyes. In that moment, Jake saw not the polished, beautiful woman who had first captivated him, but someone desperate and dangerous. "Let it go," Evelyn hissed. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? How you've made me feel? I was ready to give up everything for you, Jake. My marriage, my family, everything." As Evelyn's voice rose to a fever pitch, Jake felt a surge of panic. He turned to leave, but Evelyn was quicker. She grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "You're not going anywhere," she snarled. "Not until you admit how you really feel." Jake tried to pull away, but Evelyn's grip was surprisingly strong. As they struggled, Jake's elbow caught the edge of a side table. A heavy crystal vase teetered for a moment before crashing to the floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The sound seemed to snap Evelyn out of her frenzy. She released Jake's arm, staring in shock at the mess on the floor. Jake seized the opportunity to bolt for the door, his heart pounding in his ears. As he reached for the doorknob, Jake felt a searing pain in his back. He turned to see Evelyn standing there, a large shard of the broken vase clutched in her hand, its jagged edge now stained with his blood. "If I can't have you," Evelyn whispered, her eyes wild, "no one will." Jake's world began to spin. He slumped against the door, leaving a smear of blood as he slid to the floor. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Evelyn standing over him, the bloody crystal shard still gripped in her trembling hand. When Melissa returned home later that night, she was met with a scene of unimaginable horror. The foyer was awash in blood, shards of crystal scattered across the marble floor. And there, propped against the front door, was Jake's lifeless body. Melissa's scream echoed through the empty house. As she fell to her knees beside Jake, desperately searching for a pulse she knew she wouldn't find, she became aware of another sound. From upstairs came the faint strains of classical music and the sound of running water. In a daze, Melissa climbed the stairs, following the sounds to her parents' en-suite bathroom. She pushed open the door to find Evelyn submerged in the oversized tub, the water tinged pink with blood. Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata played softly from the speaker system. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open as Melissa entered. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice dreamy and distant. "I'm so glad you're home. I had the most terrible dream." As Melissa stared at her mother in horror, trying to reconcile this serene figure with the scene of carnage downstairs, she felt as if she were trapped in a nightmare of her own. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone to call 911, her mother's gentle humming providing a chilling soundtrack to the end of life as she knew it. The aftermath of that night unfolded like a surreal dream. The quiet suburban street was suddenly alive with the flashing lights of police cars and ambulances. The neighbors gathered in small clusters on their perfectly manicured lawns, whispering behind cupped hands as they watched the Hartley home become a crime scene. Richard Hartley, pulled from his real estate conference by a frantic call from the police, arrived home to find his world shattered. The sight of his wife being led out of the house in handcuffs, still wearing her blood-stained robe, would haunt him for years to come. As the investigation progressed, the full extent of Evelyn's obsession came to light. Detectives found a journal hidden in her studio, filled with increasingly erratic entries about Jake. What had begun as harmless fantasies had evolved into elaborate plans for a life together, peppered with dark musings about eliminating any obstacles to their supposed love. A forensic analysis of Evelyn's phone revealed hundreds of unsent messages to Jake, ranging from passionate declarations of love to chilling threats. It seemed that for every message she had actually sent, there were dozens more composed in moments of late-night desperation, never delivered but saved as drafts. The most disturbing discovery came when police searched Evelyn's studio. Hidden behind a false panel in her supply closet, they found a shrine dedicated to Jake. Photographs, many clearly taken without his knowledge, were pinned to a corkboard. Strands of dark hair, presumably Jake's, were tied with a ribbon and placed in a small box. A half-finished oil painting depicted Jake and Evelyn in a passionate embrace, their faces a blend of ecstasy and anguish. As the evidence mounted, a picture emerged of a woman who had gradually lost touch with reality, her infatuation with her daughter's boyfriend spiraling into a dangerous obsession. Psychologists brought in to evaluate Evelyn suggested that her fixation on Jake had been a manifestation of deeper issues of fear of aging, feelings of invisibility in her marriage, and a desperate desire to recapture her youth. For Melissa, each new revelation was like a fresh wound. The mother she had known, or thought she had known, seemed to have been replaced by a stranger. She found herself questioning every memory, wondering how long the seeds of this madness had been growing unnoticed. Richard, for his part, oscillated between grief, anger, and guilt. How had he not seen the signs? Had his emotional distance played a role in pushing Evelyn to this breaking point? The man who had always prided himself on his business acumen now felt like a fool, blind to the disintegration of his own family. As the case progressed towards trial, the media descended on Phoenix like vultures. The story had all the elements of a sensational tabloid drama, a beautiful suburban mother, a forbidden passion, a brutal murder. News vans clogged the streets of the once quiet neighborhood, reporters accosting anyone who might have a connection to the Hartleys or Jake. Melissa found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight. Paparazzi followed her on campus, shouting questions about her mother and Jake. Online forums buzzed with speculation and cruel jokes. Some even suggested that Melissa must have known about the affair, painting her as either complicit or hopelessly naive. The strain began to take its toll on Melissa. Her grades slipped, and she withdrew from her friends. Nightmares plagued her sleep, visions of Jake's bloodied body, of her mother's vacant eyes in the bathtub. She began seeing a therapist, trying to navigate the complex web of emotions: grief for Jake, anger at her mother, guilt over not having seen the signs earlier. Richard threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, as if he could bury his pain beneath blueprints and contracts. He sold the family home, unable to bear the memories it held, and moved into a sterile downtown apartment. His relationship with Melissa became strained, both of them unsure how to connect in the wake of such tragedy. As the trial approached, the prosecution built a strong case against Evelyn. The physical evidence was damning: Jake's blood on the crystal shard, Evelyn's fingerprints on the makeshift weapon, the incriminating journal entries, but it was the psychological evidence that painted the most disturbing picture. Dr. Amelia Rodriguez, a renowned forensic psychologist, testified about Evelyn's mental state. Mrs. Hartley exhibits signs of erotomania, a delusional disorder characterized by the false belief that another person, often of higher social status, is in love with them, Dr. Rodriguez explained to the rapt courtroom. In Mrs. Hartley's case, this delusion centered on her daughter's boyfriend, Jake Moretti. As reality continually failed to align with her fantasies, Mrs. Hartley's grip on reality weakened, ultimately leading to the tragic events of that night. Evelyn's defense team, led by high-profile attorney Marcus Bronson, pursued a strategy of not guilty by reason of insanity. They argued that Evelyn had been in the throes of a psychotic break when she killed Jake, unable to distinguish reality from her delusions. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Bronson implored in his opening statement, "What we have here is not a cold-blooded murderer, but a sick woman in desperate need of help." Evelyn Hartley's mind betrayed her, trapping her in a fantasy world where her actions seemed not only justified but necessary. She needs treatment, not punishment. The trial lasted for 3 grueling weeks. Each day, Melissa forced herself to sit in the courtroom, listening to the clinical dissection of her mother's madness and the final, terrible moments of Jake's life. She watched her mother, seated at the defense table in muted clothing and minimal makeup, a far cry from the glamorous woman she had once been. Evelyn's eyes, once so full of life, now seemed dull and unfocused, as if she were looking at something no one else could see. Melissa was called to testify, an experience she would later describe as the most difficult of her life. Under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, with her mother's vacant stare fixed upon her, Melissa recounted the months leading up to Jake's death. And she spoke of her growing suspicions, the confrontation in the garden, the final, terrible night. Her voice broke as she described finding Jake's body and the strange, dreamlike encounter with her mother in the bathtub. As Melissa stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met her mother's for a brief moment. In that instant, she saw a flicker of the woman she had once known, a flash of recognition, of horror, of overwhelming sorrow. But as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, replaced once more by that unsettling, far-away look. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching a verdict. As the courtroom fell silent, the foreman stood, her voice clear and steady, as she read the decision on the charge of murder in the first degree. We find the defendant, Evelyn Hartley, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Melissa felt a strange mix of relief and anguish wash over her. Beside her, Richard let out a shuddering breath, his hand finding hers and squeezing tightly. Evelyn showed no reaction to the verdict, her gaze fixed on some middle distance, as if the proceedings had nothing to do with her. Judge Miranda Holbrook, a stern woman with graying hair and piercing blue eyes, took a moment to gather her thoughts before delivering the sentence. She looked directly at Evelyn, her gaze unflinching. Evelyn Hartley, the crime you have committed has not only taken a young life but has also shattered your own family and deeply affected this community, Judge Holbrook began. While the court acknowledges the mental health issues that contributed to your actions, the premeditated nature of this crime cannot be overlooked. The judge paused, her eyes sweeping across the packed courtroom before continuing. By taking into account all factors presented during this trial, I hereby sentence you to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Additionally, I am ordering comprehensive psychiatric treatment as part of your incarceration. As Evelyn was led away by court officers, Melissa felt a sense of finality wash over her. The long nightmare of the investigation and trial was over, but she knew the impact of her mother's actions would reverberate through her life for years to come,